The neighbor thought inviting guests to that hot tub was just fun, but it was a power play wrapped in racism. When Big Shaq saw the line being crossed, he didn't just defend his home. He exposed a quiet war hiding behind fences and fake smiles. What happened next didn't just shake the block, it rewrote the rules. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. Big Shaq had walked away from arenas filled with thunderous applause to find something quieter, something real. Fame had given him everything: money, admiration, opportunities. But none of that rivaled the pull of peace, so he settled into Chestnut Grove, a meticulously manicured neighborhood in the northern suburbs of Atlanta, where tree-lined streets whispered calm, and the air smelled like clean lawns and Sunday cookouts. He bought the corner house, the one with the wraparound porch and the oak that had survived 2 tornado seasons. It was his sanctuary, a place where the echoes of his past life faded behind warm morning coffee and the slow rhythm of ordinary days. To many, he was a retired legend, a towering figure with a heart of gold and a voice deep enough to vibrate window panes. But to the residents of Chestnut Grove, he was something more complicated, admired from afar, but not truly embraced. He waved at the neighbors, smiled at the mailman, helped the elderly woman across the street carry her groceries every Tuesday. But the warmth he offered was rarely returned with the same sincerity. There was a coded language in Chestnut Grove, unspoken yet ever present: a glance too long, a smile too tight, an invite that never came. Shaq wasn't naive. He knew what it meant when people complimented his yard, but never stopped to chat. When HOA meetings ended 5 minutes early, the one week he showed up, or when the local neighborhood app buzzed about suspicious activity after he had a cookout with old friends from his NBA days. Despite this, he remained gracious. He had lived enough lives to know when silence carried weight. He'd been the first black man in boardrooms, the only one on chartered flights, the token voice on panels meant to check diversity boxes. But in Chestnut Grove, the dynamics felt more personal. Like his presence somehow disturbed the fragile illusion of uniformity the neighborhood quietly protected. His home, though, bore his soul. The front yard held a basketball hoop that gleamed in the morning sun. Children from nearby blocks would often drift toward it, drawn by the myth of who lived there. Shaq welcomed them, taught them layups, corrected their stance, even if their parents later reminded them not to bother the neighbors. He let it slide. He always did. His patience was long, born of a life that demanded endurance, but lately something had begun to shift. It started with the Rockwells moving in next door. Their house, a pristine white colonial with black shutters, seemed to glare at his more lived-in, earth-toned home. Grayson Rockwell, the patriarch, introduced himself with a practiced smile and eyes that scanned Shaq's property like an appraisal. His wife, Marlene, handed over a basket of muffins with the subtle urgency of someone trying to exit the interaction before it became too familiar. Their kids, high school-aged and distant, rarely made eye contact. And while many in Chestnut Grove kept their distance out of passive caution, the Rockwells carried a more active disapproval masked beneath performative politeness. Over the weeks, their gatherings grew louder, their guests more frequent. Weekends meant music, laughter, and cigar smoke drifting into Shaq's backyard, like an invisible fence daring him to complain. Still, he held back. He had faced bigger storms than neighborhood noise. But one evening, as he watered his tulips, he overheard it, not a loud insult or a shouted slur, but a comment, just low enough to feel secret, just loud enough for him to hear. "Must be nice, all that money and still bringing the neighborhood down." It came from a man he didn't recognize. One of the Rockwells' guests. Shaq froze. The hose continued to spray the ground, his grip tightening on the handle. He didn't say a word. The guest laughed, unaware or uncaring that he'd been heard. Grayson didn't correct him. Instead, he chuckled and poured another drink. Shaq finished watering the flowers, turned off the hose, and walked inside without a glance toward the fence line. But that night, he didn't sleep. Something had changed. The mask had slipped, and beneath it lay the same old rot, dressed in khakis and cologne, but no less toxic. Days passed, but the feeling lingered. At the next HOA meeting, Shaq entered the community center in his usual calm, deliberate manner. Conversations dimmed. The air stiffened. He nodded to the chairwoman, sat near the back, and listened as issues were raised. Noise complaints, lawn violations, discussion of new bylaws, nothing said outright. But then came the suggestion that backyard structures should be limited in size and placement. Shaq's basketball court and his gazebo were the only structures of note. The motion didn't pass. Not yet. But the intent was clear. Shaq walked home that evening with a new stillness in his chest. He looked at his garden, at the children's chalk drawings, still faintly visible on the driveway, at the tulips that leaned ever so slightly toward the Rockwells' property. He was done being passive, done pretending silence was enough. The rules were shifting, and he could feel the storm gathering behind the neighborly grins and well-pruned hedges. A quiet giant had entered this neighborhood with the hope of peace, but peace, he was beginning to understand, came at a price, and some folks were already trying to collect. Chestnut Grove was the kind of place that convinced outsiders they had stumbled into the American dream. Each street was a catalog page, white picket fences, matching shutters, and driveways paved to geometric perfection. Children rode bikes in quiet loops, parents waved from porch swings, and golden retrievers trotted along sidewalks like furry mascots of conformity. To the untrained eye, it was paradise, tidy, predictable, and safe. But paradise had rules, and not all of them were written down. For all its curated charm, the neighborhood operated like a private club. It didn't post a list of requirements, but everyone understood who fit the mold and who simply tolerated within it. The currency of Chestnut Grove wasn't money. Everyone had plenty. It was saneness, and saneness in this place came in shades of beige. The Rockwells understood this. That's what made them dangerous. Grayson Rockwell carried himself like he had signed the deed to the American ideal. His posture, his handshake, even his button-downs, always crisp, never creased, spoke of a man who believed in hierarchy, in quiet power, in invisible lines. He smiled like a man who'd never been told no, and when he spoke, it was always in a measured tone that disguised the intent underneath. His wife, Marlene, was the kind of woman who scheduled charity brunches and didn't blink twice if the guest list lacked diversity. Their arrival at Chestnut Grove had felt seamless, even celebrated. They were the kind of family who Shaq watched them with a patience most didn't understand. He observed Grayson host small evening gatherings, each one slightly louder, slightly more exclusive than the last. It started with wine tastings, then poker nights, and soon the hot tub sessions began. Weekends filled with the same faces, same voices, same knowing glances when Shaq walked past. The hot tub sat too close to the property line, steam rising like a veil between two worlds. From his second-story window, Shaq noticed a pattern. The guests weren't just friends, they were selected. Developers, attorneys, city officials, not the casual neighborhood crowd. These meetings had structure, rhythm, and more importantly, intention. Property lines, zoning code, local ordinances, all became points of hushed conversation. Shaq didn't need to hear every word to understand that he was the unspoken subject of those talks. He could feel it in the way their laughter grew when he walked by, in the way their eyes shifted from him to each other, as if confirming something agreed upon in advance. Then came the passive maneuvers, the unspoken codes at work. One neighbor, a man named Drew Ellison, casually asked Shaq if his basketball court had proper permits. Another left a note on Shaq's door reminding him about HOA regulations on structure heights, even though his gazebo was well within the limit. But the boldest move came one morning, when Shaq found a section of his fence pushed back 3 feet, right at the edge of the Rockwells' lawn. No explanation, no apology, just silence and freshly disturbed soil. He didn't react. Not visibly. That was the thing about Chestnut Grove. It baited people into reacting, so it could turn their response into the problem. Anger was ammunition for these people. Shaq had lived long enough to know how perception worked, how easily a calm black man could be painted as threatening simply by raising his voice. Instead, he took photos, measured the fence line, checked the original property lines from when he bought the house. Every move, every shift he documented. The Rockwells might have thought they were playing a quiet game, but Shaq had already seen too many like it played out in boardrooms and backrooms across America. Even the kids noticed. Neighborhood teens, who once waved now crossed the street. One boy, maybe 15, muttered a slur under his breath as he passed Shaq's driveway. It wasn't loud, but it was clear. Shaq didn't move. He just watched the boy walk on, a chill tightening his chest, not from the words but from how easily they'd been spoken, as if practiced at home. Then, something unexpected happened. During one of the Rockwells' hot tub gatherings, A woman named Lorraine Castle, a mid-40s sharp-eyed realtor, made a comment that drifted over the fence. He might be rich, but he'll never really belong, will he? Her tone was light, almost flippant, as if it were just part of the cocktail chatter. Shaq heard it, heard the way Grayson chuckled in response, heard the ice clink in glasses, the water slosh gently. But Lorraine didn't know who else heard it. Delora Hensley, the long-retired social worker, who lived 2 doors down, had been walking her dog on the sidewalk just behind them. She didn't speak, she didn't look back. But her steps slowed, and the next day she knocked on Shaq's door. She didn't bring muffins or pleasantries, just a manila folder. "I've lived here 30 years, she said, her voice calm but steady. "I know what they're doing. I've seen them do it before." Inside the folder were records, complaints, HOA meeting minutes, zoning challenges, all tied to minority homeowners over the past decade. Quiet, buried attempts to push people out. Shaq studied the papers in silence, each page building a map of the quiet war Chestnut Grove had been fighting for years. Delora said little more, only that she was tired of pretending not to see it. Then she left, as quietly as she came. That night, Shaq sat on his porch long after the sun went down. The air was still. The street lamps cast soft pools of light across the sidewalks. Behind him, his house stood steady, his fortress. But around him, the neighborhood pulsed with quiet resistance, coded rules and veiled hostility. He understood now. The hot tub wasn't a problem. It was a symbol, a signal, and whatever game the Rockwells thought they were playing, Shaq was no longer just watching. He was preparing. Saturday afternoons in Chestnut Grove shifted like clockwork once the Rockwells' social calendar kicked in. At precisely 3 o'clock, the backyard next to Shaq's would spring to life. Music thudded gently through the hedges, wine glasses clinked, and voices always loud, always the same, rose above the hum of the neighborhood's usual calm. The Rockwells' hot tub became the epicenter of these gatherings, steam swirling around carefully curated groups of guests who arrived in tailored polos and sundresses, never a single wrinkle out of place. Each week, the crowd stayed consistent: city officials, a couple of real estate developers, a county board member, and a new addition, a sharply dressed man named Halder Miles. Shaq noticed him immediately. Unlike the rest, Halder didn't bother with small talk or neighborly smiles. He arrived in silence, his eyes scanning the Rockwells' backyard like a chessboard. He always brought a slim black folder, the kind used in meetings where things were decided behind closed doors. From his kitchen window, Shaq observed every move. He didn't need to hear every word to understand the game that was unfolding. The backyard was no longer just a social space. It was a command center. Documents were passed hand to hand beneath towels. Phones were placed deliberately on tables, screens down. Once Shaq watched as Halder and Grayson leaned over a printed plat map, his property outlined in bold red ink. The gatherings grew louder, bolder. What began as whispered conversations about community cohesion quickly spiraled into something less subtle. One evening, after the 5th round of drinks, a voice drifted across the fence, rough with arrogance and intoxication. "Honestly," the man said, "Shaquille's little empire next door is like graffiti on granite. All that flash, all that money, and still doesn't know how to keep things civilized." The laughter that followed stung not for its volume, but for its ease. Shaq didn't react. His silence wasn't surrender. It was observation. He jotted the date, the voices, the sequence. This wasn't just social exclusion anymore. This was an organized pressure campaign, dressed up as backyard leisure. The parties spilled further each week. Inflatable loungers crept toward Shaq's fence line. Cigarette butts appeared on his lawn. The music grew more brazen, a strange blend of jazz and mockery. He found empty wine bottles tucked beneath his hedges, beer caps rolling into his tulip beds. It was always framed as accidental, but Shaq knew better. Every detail was strategic, a provocation wrapped in plausible deniability. Then came Halder's comment. Shaq had stepped out late one Saturday evening to retrieve a package left by the mailman. As he bent to pick it up, voices from the Rockwells' hot tub drifted over the fence, close, unfiltered. Halder's voice was clear, calculated. "You give a man a mansion and $1 million, and he still brings the wrong kind of energy. You know what I mean? It's in the blood. Not their fault, really. Just can't help themselves." The silence that followed was worse than laughter. It was agreement. No one challenged it. No one recoiled. Grayson, Somewhere in that cluster of voices and steam, responded with a lazy, "Well, that's why we're here, isn't it?" Shaq stood frozen, the package gripped tight in his hand. The words hit differently, not because they were new, but because of the space they filled. A backyard, a neighborhood, a place where children played, where he had chosen to be invisible, to blend in. Yet still they painted him as other. He walked back inside, without a word. Sat on his couch, and for the first time since he moved in, he felt the weight of being outnumbered, not by bodies, but by intent. The Rockwells weren't just neighbors, they were architects of a slow erasure. One party at a time, they were trying to redraw the lines, culturally and literally. Shaq didn't sleep that night. Instead, he opened his laptop. He searched public records on Halder Miles, real estate litigation attorney, known for representing large-scale property developers in cases of eminent domain and rezoning. He had a reputation for leveraging neighborhood complaints into forced sales. Shaq kept digging, found articles, court briefs, client rosters. Patterns emerged. Properties that changed hands quietly after noise complaints and code violations. All of them in gentrifying areas. All of them owned by people who looked like him. Shaq closed the laptop as the first light broke over Chestnut Grove. The Rockwells had stopped pretending. The hot tub had become their boardroom, and now he had no choice but to respond, not with fists or fury, but with something far more powerful, with truth. It began as a gut feeling. Something beyond the noise. The wine bottles, the careless insults. Shaq had been around too many deals, too many boardroom hustles, to miss the smell of a plan in motion. There was structure in the Rockwells' chaos, a pattern in their gatherings that betrayed intention. It wasn't just weekend leisure, these were operations disguised as pool parties, meetings cloaked in bathrobes, and cocktail glasses. From his upstairs study, Shaq watched through a half-closed curtain as the same faces returned week after week. Always the same rotation. Halder Miles, the zoning lawyer with a reputation for backdoor pressure. Regina Grant, a financial planner tied to local redevelopment efforts. And Brent Warwick, who chaired the county's Neighborhood Quality and Development Task Force. It wasn't coincidence, not in a place like Chestnut Grove. The details sharpened, with time. Phones disappeared as soon as the guests entered the Rockwells' backyard, placed in a mahogany drawer that Grayson opened with a practiced flick of his wrist. Documents. Some laminated, some clipped, changed hands subtly, never left unattended. Conversations happened in corners, behind strategically placed patio umbrellas, or beneath the hot tub's rising steam. Shaq didn't just watch. He recorded every gathering, every face, every timestamp logged into a secure drive. He positioned discreet security cameras angled high, legally placed, but effective. They captured the choreography of these summits. Who arrived when, how long they stayed, who laughed at what, and most importantly, when the documents appeared. It was during one of these recordings that Shaq caught a name he didn't recognize. Green River Holdings. Halder mentioned it while passing a folder to Grayson, voice low but not low enough. Once Green River gets the variance, the plots fall into place. Shaq paused the footage, rewound, played it again. Variance. Plots. This wasn't idle strategy, it was zoning. He dove into research, tracing Green River Holdings through shell companies and cross-registered LLCs. The deeper he went, the clearer the picture became. Green River wasn't just a firm, it was a vehicle. One used to acquire undervalued residential property, often following targeted pressure campaigns in transitional neighborhoods. Chestnut Grove, with its aging population and undeclared racial hierarchy, was ripe for the kind of redevelopment that masked removal beneath market terms. And smack in the middle of that redevelopment zone stood Shaq's property, larger than most, more modernized, and with enough land to split into two high-value lots. The gatherings weren't just about Grayson's ego or Halder's ignorance. They were about asset repositioning. And Shaq's home was step one. The water wasn't just echoing anymore. It was whispering truths. Then came the drone. One afternoon, while tending to his tulips, Shaq noticed a low hum overhead. A small commercial-grade drone hovered briefly above his backyard before veering toward the Rockwells. He didn't react visibly, but he clocked it. The next day, a similar drone returned, this time staying longer, sweeping low near his gazebo. He retrieved footage from his cameras and froze the frames. It wasn't kids playing with tech, this was professional surveying. He called Delora Hensley, The retired social worker arrived within minutes holding a tin of lemon cookies like it was armor. She didn't need long to understand. One look at the folder Shaq had compiled, photos, recordings, public records, was enough. She tapped a shaky finger on a map of the neighborhood. "You see this corner?" she asked, pointing at a triangular patch of land adjoining Shaq's and the Rockwells' properties. That used to be community space. Until 2007. They had it rezoned quietly, claimed it was underutilized. 2 families left within 6 months. Shaq leaned back, processing. Delora continued. "They do it in waves, never all at once. It's cleaner that way. The hot tub meetings are just the stage. The script's already written." That night, Shaq couldn't shake the image of his home outlined in red on Halder's map. He looked out at the court where kids once played, now empty. The garden he'd planted with care, the gazebo that had hosted veterans, pastors, musicians, and kids from the youth center he funded. To the Rockwells, it wasn't legacy, it was leverage. He printed every document, clipped every file, labeled every recording. This wasn't just about defending property anymore. It was about exposing a network. Shaq had influence, but influence meant nothing if it wasn't used with precision. He began drafting a plan, not revenge, not reaction, but revelation. Something that would unravel the narrative the Rockwells had been stitching together, thread by thread. The next Saturday, the hot tub party resumed, as usual. Same faces, same music. But this time, Shaq was ready. He stayed inside, curtains drawn, lights off, observing, documenting, waiting. He wasn't just collecting evidence anymore. He was preparing a mirror. The water rippled, the laughter rose, but beneath it something else began to stir. And for the first time the Rockwells had no idea who was really holding the pen. The morning it happened, the sun had barely crested over Chestnut Grove's rooftops. Shaq stepped outside with a mug of black coffee, his eyes still adjusting to the light, his body tuned to the rhythm of quiet hours before the neighborhood stirred. But something was off. Not the usual, this was different. Subtle, like a shift in shadow that didn't belong. He walked to the edge of his lawn and stopped. The fence had moved. Not by much, 4, maybe 5 inches, but enough for someone like Shaq, who knew the lay of his property like the beat of his own pulse, to spot the discrepancy instantly. The wooden posts no longer aligned with the stone marker that sat buried just beneath the rose bush he'd planted last spring, and the bushes near the southeast corner, once evenly trimmed against the dividing line, now leaned awkwardly into his space, as though nudged by a rearranged truth. He stared at the fence, coffee forgotten in his hand, jaw tight. This wasn't a prank. It wasn't a contractor's error. It was a move, a deliberate, calculated move in a game that had grown increasingly brazen. The Rockwells weren't playing neighborly games anymore. They were claiming ground, quietly, illegally. By noon, Shaq was inside his office, surrounded by property records and blueprints. He unearthed the original deed from when he bought the house, a thick stack of documentation he hadn't touched in years. The measurements were precise. The border between the properties had been clearly defined, marked by county-registered coordinates and 3 permanent fixtures, including the stone marker now in dispute. But what truly caught his eye was a side clause buried in the purchase documents. Any boundary adjustments shall require written mutual consent, filed with the HOA and county records. There was no such filing, no HOA notification, no agreement, nothing legal about the shift. Just a quiet nudge, and the hope that it would go unnoticed. He logged into the county assessor's portal, pulling aerial images of the property from the last 5 years. One by one he lined them up, noting how the fence had crept over time, not dramatically, but just enough that a distracted owner might miss it. Each move, each shift camouflaged as maintenance, as wear, as routine. Shaq realized then that this wasn't spontaneous. It had been happening in increments. The Rockwells were inching in like a tide, believing eventually he'd just adjust, give in, maybe even sell. But they had miscalculated. He drove to the zoning office the next day, not as Shaquille O'Neal, former NBA legend, but as a resident, a citizen. He requested plot surveys, historical overlays, any submitted variances tied to Chestnut Grove's eastern corner. The clerk, a thin, red-haired woman named Missy, recognized him immediately, but said nothing beyond a polite nod. Her professionalism was sharp, efficient. When she handed over the documents, Shaq saw it, an informal variance request filed 2 weeks earlier, submitted by Grayson Rockwell. It cited land ambiguity and historical fence confusion, due to tree root encroachment. It was cleverly worded, dressed in legal ambiguity. If approved, it would grant the Rockwells an easement that cut 5 feet into Shaq's property, just enough to devalue his land for resale, just enough to reclassify his gazebo as a non-compliant structure. He thanked Missy and left with the files under his arm, the weight of them more psychological than physical. This wasn't about landscaping. It wasn't about noise complaints or aesthetic disagreements. This was territorial warfare, the kind where paper was the weapon, and silence was the strategy. Back home, Shaq stood again at the fence, his eyes not on the wood, but on what it represented. In communities like Chestnut Grove, power wasn't always loud. It didn't wear uniforms or carry torches. It whispered behind closed doors, signed things in triplicate, and told you the problem was all in your head. He recalled his grandfather's voice from long ago. They don't always push you out, son. Sometimes they just shift the line until you ain't got room to stand. The truth was, the Rockwells didn't want his land. They wanted the precedent. If they could move his line, they could move anyone's. And if a man like Shaq, wealthy, prominent, composed, could be boxed out without lifting a finger, what hope did the average neighbor have? Shaq wasn't interested in vengeance. He wasn't wired for petty feuds. But he understood leverage, influence. He understood optics, timing, and precision. And most of all, he understood what it meant to be underestimated. The fence, once a symbol of boundary and respect, had become a line in the sand. And now, the game would shift. Delora Hensley had lived in Chestnut Grove longer than any of them. 30 years in the same caramel-colored brick house, curtains always ironed, porch plants always fresh, mailbox never overfilled. She was the neighborhood's quiet constant, always there, rarely involved, eyes sharper than anyone suspected. People saw her and assumed age had softened her. What they didn't know was that age had made her watchful, and 30 years of silence had turned into a vault of stories no one dared to ask about. Shaq first truly noticed her not during one of their brief wave from across the lawn exchanges, but the morning after the fence incident. He had been inspecting the shifted posts again, when he looked up and caught her watching from her porch, rocking gently, her hand wrapped around a thermos. She didn't smile, didn't look away. She simply nodded once, like someone confirming a fact that no longer needed proving. Later that day, she showed up at his door. She didn't knock twice, didn't stumble over pleasantries. She stepped inside like someone who already understood the nature of an unspoken war. "I know what they're doing," she said, her voice firm, steady, without the rust of age, "because I've seen them do it before." She carried a small floral printed accordion folder that creaked when she set it down. Inside were papers, some yellowed, some printed from ancient fax machines, others more recent. Complaints, records, notices, names, dates, all tied to families who had once lived on this same block. A black pediatrician who had installed a fence that violated HOA guidelines by a quarter inch. A Latino couple who received noise complaints every time their church group visited. A single mother whose mortgage lender was mysteriously contacted after a zoning issue was filed without her knowledge. Delora pointed to a pattern. "They call it code enforcement," she said. "But what it is, it's coercion." Her own notes were meticulous. Handwritten annotations, clippings from local newsletters, even a grainy photo of a former HOA president shaking hands with a county developer. Shaq leafed through the documents slowly, piecing together what she had known for years. The Rockwells hadn't just appeared. They were part of a lineage, neighbors who didn't confront, didn't shout. They pushed papers, made calls, and turned the wheels of exclusion with terrifying efficiency. "I tried to warn the others," Delora said, leaning back in her chair. "But most folks are too busy trying to survive. They don't have your platform, or your patience." Shaq said little. He didn't need to. In Delora he found not just an ally, but a witness. Someone who had catalogued the slow erosion of fairness in a neighborhood that wore civility like a mask. She handed him a USB stick. "It's all backed up here too. Just in case." He took it, and for the first time in weeks, the weight in his chest shifted, not lifted, but realigned. It wasn't just him. He wasn't imagining the hostility, the precision, the invisible hands shaping public opinion. There had been others. Victims. Survivors. Silent. Delora didn't ask for anything in return. No recognition. No repayment. She only said one thing before she stood to leave. "You're not the first they've tried to corner. But you can be the last." From that moment, she became something of a sentinel, rarely seen, but always watching. She'd pass Shaq's small notes, slipped beneath his mailbox lid. Grayson met with city inspector today, 3:20 p.m., or Halder's SUV in HOA lot, parked under camera blind spot. Information, delivered with surgical precision. She had eyes everywhere. And more importantly, she remembered everything. Shaq integrated her data with his own recordings, cross-referencing times, dates, faces. The web grew denser, more organized. What once felt like neighborly hostility was now unmistakable conspiracy. The Rockwells weren't just nudging boundaries. They were enacting a blueprint, and their history of quiet forceouts was no longer buried in rumor. It was printed, signed, timestamped. Delora's file drawer, once a forgotten corner of her study, had become a weapon of truth. One night, as Shaq sat alone watching surveillance footage, he noticed something small but chilling. In a moment of casual conversation, Grayson handed Halder a rolled blueprint. They laughed. Then Grayson gestured toward the fence, the one he'd shifted, the one still in legal limbo. Halder nodded, raised his glass, and replied, all falling into place. Shaq paused the footage, stared at the still frame, his property, their plan. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly account for, was Delora, the woman with decades of silence behind her. In a memory too sharp to forget, by late spring the tension in Chestnut Grove was no longer beneath the surface. It rippled through trimmed lawns, laced itself into casual greetings, and clung to the edges of each carefully worded email from the Homeowners Association. The Rockwells, no longer hiding behind passive maneuvers, had set their next move in motion. It came wrapped in official language, delivered through a glossy agenda slipped into every mailbox. Proposal 14B, Amendment to Restrict Unauthorized Backyard Structures. On paper, it sounded like a harmless effort to maintain neighborhood aesthetics. In reality, it was a scalpel aimed directly at Shaq's property, his basketball court, his gazebo, and everything they represented. The meeting was scheduled for the first Monday evening of the month, held in the Chestnut Grove Community Pavilion, a space designed to look inviting but always felt sterile. Folding chairs lined the floor in neat rows. A long table up front bore nameplates for HOA board members, most of whom had grown eerily silent in recent weeks. Grayson Rockwell sat at the center, chairing the meeting with the poise of a man who believed the outcome was already settled. Residents trickled in, murmuring in low tones. Some avoided eye contact with Shaq entirely. Others gave him quick nods, not out of support but out of discomfort. People caught between their silence and their complicity. Shaq arrived 10 minutes early, wearing a slate gray suit that fit like resolve. He carried no folders, no briefcases, just himself. Towering, deliberate, unreadable, and beside him walked Delora Hensley, dressed in a navy sweater and flats, her pace steady, her face calm. The moment they entered, the room shifted. Grayson glanced up, eyes narrowing. Halder, seated 2 rows behind, stiffened just enough for Shaq to catch it. The rest of the board exchanged quick glances, nervous, uncertain. The meeting began with routine matters: lawn care budgets, community newsletter changes, a new dog waste station. Then came agenda item. Grayson cleared his throat. This amendment, if approved, will help preserve the aesthetic balance of Chestnut Grove by restricting unapproved backyard structures, specifically those exceeding 6 feet in height or spanning more than 200 square feet. The language was sanitized, but the intent was soaked in malice. The only 2 properties with such structures were Shaq's, and everyone knew it. We've had multiple complaints, Grayson continued, from residents concerned about visual clutter, noise, and safety issues. This is about maintaining our community standard. Before a vote could be called, Shaq stood. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His presence alone quieted the room. I've got something to say, he began, his voice smooth but sharpened. And before y'all vote on a rule designed to erase what I built, I think it's time a few things came to light. He turned toward Delora, who reached into her tote and handed him a single USB drive. He passed it to the board's AV technician, an awkward college-aged volunteer who looked unsure whether to proceed. But with the board nodding under the pressure of the moment, the screen lit up. What played next was a series of surveillance clips, carefully curated. Footage of Halder and Grayson in the Rockwells' backyard, blueprint in hand. Audio of Halder's comment about the wrong kind of energy. a drone hovering low over Shaq's garden, and finally Grayson gesturing toward Shaq's property while murmuring, "It's easier to force them out quietly than get tied up in headlines." Gasps echoed through the room. But Shaq wasn't finished. He pulled out printed documentation, filed deed restrictions, original HOA bylaws, and a signed affidavit from the county's zoning clerk, confirming that no formal complaints had ever been filed regarding his structures. He paced slowly, every step deliberate. "This isn't about community," he said. "It's about control. It's about reshaping this neighborhood 1 inch, one structure, one person at a time, until it looks how they want it to look." Dolores stood beside him then, her voice clear despite its softness. "I've lived here longer than anyone in this room," she said. "I've watched what happens to the people who don't fit a certain mold. You've erased them quietly. I kept the records. And now you can't deny them." Murmurs turned to a swell of unease. The board members looked from one another to the screen, then to the documents, then to the floor. Grayson tried to interject, but his voice cracked under the weight of exposure. "This is being taken out of context." "No," Shaq interrupted, eyes steady. "Context is exactly what this gives." Someone in the crowd clapped, then another. Soon a slow ripple of applause spread, not thunderous but sincere. People who had stayed quiet now found their voices, even if only in support. The board motioned to table the vote, indefinitely. Shaq and Delora walked out without looking back, the screen behind them frozen on a frame of Grayson mid-smirk, his mask finally slipping. Outside, the air felt different. Lighter. For the first time in months, it didn't press in on Shaq's shoulders. The battle wasn't over, but the script had changed. And now, the neighborhood knew who was really writing it. After the HOA meeting, the neighborhood exhaled, but it wasn't relief. It was the nervous breath people take when they realize the room is not what they thought it was. The applause had faded, but the ripple effects hadn't. Conversations shifted. Sidewalk greetings turned into quiet whispers. Shaq's name circulated not just in passing, but in hushed discussions between hedges and under porch lights. The man who had once been tolerated was now unavoidable, and so was the truth he had brought with him. Behind closed doors, the Rockwells regrouped. Grayson had spent years mastering his image, a community leader, a generous host, a model neighbor, but the mask once flawless now bore visible cracks. The footage from the HOA meeting had stripped the polish from his charm, revealing the precise movements of a man orchestrating exclusion under the guise of civic order. And it wasn't just the footage Shaq had shown. What the community didn't know yet was that there was more, much more. In the weeks following Delora's visit, Shaq had worked quietly to assemble a mosaic of proof, and Delora had provided the final damning piece. Years ago, after witnessing what she called the slow erasure of two families, one black, one Hispanic, she'd placed 3 hidden microphones in her property's outer walls, strategically aimed toward the Rockwells' yard. They were legal, placed on her own property, recording only what could be heard in open air. And what they captured over the past year told the full story. Every slur cloaked in laughter. Every concern disguised as policy talk. Every time Grayson used phrases like cleansing the aesthetic or rebalancing the demographic, phrases that sounded bureaucratic but were nothing more than rebranded racism. There were clips of Halder offering campaign donations in exchange for favorable zoning opinions, and a particularly damning moment where Regina Grant, the financial planner, suggested the best way to push Shaq out was to scare the sponsors away, to make Chestnut Grove seem like a PR risk for someone of his public stature. Shaq sat through hours of these recordings, jaw tight, hands clasped, heart steady. It wasn't outrage he felt anymore. It was clarity. This wasn't speculation or suspicion. It was organized social engineering, weaponized influence, backed by a system too comfortable in its silence. He compiled the footage, paired it with time-stamped video from his own surveillance system, and labeled each segment. Every file bore a date, a voice, and a quote. No guessing, no conjecture, just facts, laid out like evidence in a courtroom. It wasn't just a neighborhood dispute now. It was a case study in how systemic racism operated when hidden behind fences and polite smiles. When the folder was complete, Shaq didn't go to the police. He didn't go to a lawyer. He went to the media. Not the tabloids. Not the nightly news. He chose the Ledger, a regional investigative outlet known for digging into civic corruption and quietly buried stories. He sent the package anonymously, knowing his identity would be obvious the moment the reporters heard the recordings. He didn't need credit. He needed exposure. 2 weeks later, the headline dropped. Audio reveals suburban racism, hidden in HOA policies. A former NBA star at the center of a targeted campaign. The article exploded. Within hours, it trended online. News vans showed up at the gates of Chestnut Grove. Reporters hovered at the community entrance. The Rockwells went silent. Blinds drawn, statements deferred to a local attorney who claimed defamation, but said little else. Grayson was removed from the HOA board within 48 hours. Halder's law firm placed him on indefinite administrative leave. Regina Grant's business lost 4 corporate accounts in 3 days. The neighborhood fractured. Some residents clung to feigned ignorance, acting as if they were shocked, truly shocked by what had been said behind Shaq's back. "I had no idea," one woman told a local reporter while watering her begonias. Others, the quiet ones who had long suspected something darker beneath the neighborhood's order, began to step forward. A mixed-race couple who had stayed quiet for years emailed Shaq a letter of support. A retired firefighter had admitted to being pressured into reporting noise from a family gathering at Shaq's home. Even the young teen who once mumbled a slur under his breath offered a hesitant, stammered apology through a note left in Shaq's mailbox, signed only with his initials. But not everyone came around. Some neighbors still crossed the street rather than make eye contact. Others looked out through blinds, but never opened their doors. The old codes hadn't vanished. They'd just been exposed. And that was enough for now. Shaq didn't speak to the press. Not once. He didn't need to. The truth had its own voice, and it was louder than anything he could say. Delora, meanwhile, returned to her routines. She never stepped into the spotlight. She kept walking her dog each morning, tending to her porch plants, and rocking gently on her chair. But everyone in the neighborhood now saw her a little differently. Not as a harmless old woman, but as a keeper of stories. A witness who had quietly preserved the truth until someone strong enough arrived to carry it forward. The Rockwells stopped hosting gatherings. The hot tub sat unused, the water slowly clouding. What once symbolized their control now stood as a relic of a strategy gone wrong. But Shaq knew it wasn't over. Power didn't surrender. It adapted. And while the neighborhood had been forced to look in the mirror, what it did next would determine whether this reckoning became a turning point, or just another temporary disruption. For now, though, the tapes had done what years of whispers could not. They'd cracked the illusion. And once broken, illusions rarely rebuild the same. The Rockwells' backyard had fallen silent. Where laughter once spilled over fences, and wine glasses clinked like ceremonial drums, there was now only stillness. The hot tub, once a hub of strategy and smug camaraderie, sat covered in a cracked vinyl tarp, untouched. Its once steamy waters had cooled, clouded, forgotten. The chairs were stacked, the fire pit, cold. A strange hush had settled over that side of the fence, a stillness that wasn't peace, but retreat. Invitations had stopped going out. Or maybe they still did, but no one answered. Those who had once lined up to sip bourbon in Grayson Rockwell's glow now found other places to be. The spotlight had scorched more than just his reputation. It had exposed the machinery behind the image, and when the illusion shattered, so did the loyalty. Across the fence, something new was blooming. Shaq, never one to bask in someone else's fall, turned his attention toward what could be built. The section of his property that had once been disputed, where the fence had been subtly shifted, was now being transformed into a community garden. It began with a few wheelbarrows, some timber frames, a delivery of fresh soil. He installed rain barrels, compost bins, and a small tool shed. The fence was replaced, not with something tall or imposing, but a waist-high wooden picket, painted in soft pine green. It wasn't about ownership anymore. It was about reclamation. He didn't advertise it. He didn't call the press, but word got around. Slowly, volunteers began to appear. An elderly couple from the far end of the street brought tomato plants and folding chairs. A single dad from across the boulevard helped install raised beds. Even a few teenagers from the local high school showed up, unprompted, unsure but willing. Delora arrived one morning with a tray of herb starters and a quiet smile. "You plant good things," she said, "and good things come back." The garden grew quickly, not just in vegetables, but in spirit. It became a meeting place, a middle ground. People who had once only nodded at each other in driveways now shared watering duties and compost tips. Children painted wooden signs for the carrot rows, someone hung wind chimes, and beneath the soft rustle of leaves, a different kind of conversation began. But not everyone welcomed the shift. One night, well past midnight, Shaq stepped out onto his porch, drawn by a rustle in the hedges and the faint crunch of gravel. The air was thick with Georgia humidity, the sky veiled in clouds. Streetlights cast dull halos on the pavement. Everything was still, except for the figure standing near the edge of his property. Grayson. He wasn't moving, just standing there, one hand in his pocket, the other loosely holding what looked like a drink, though it hung forgotten at his side. His face was partially shadowed, but even in the dark, Shaq could see what hadn't been visible before. Defeat. Not the kind that came with public embarrassment or professional fallout. Something deeper. A fracture. The look of a man who had built a house of cards and was now buried beneath its ruins. Shaq didn't speak. He simply watched, arms crossed, weight evenly balanced. If Grayson had come to yell, or argue, or threaten, he would have done so already. But he didn't. He just stood there, as if trying to summon the courage to step forward, or perhaps the decency to walk away. Eventually he turned. Not quickly, not ashamed, just slowly, like someone who had accepted the weight of something irreversible. He disappeared back into his yard, into his dimmed house, into whatever shadows he now called his own. Shaq stood there a while longer, not shaken, not triumphant, just still. He knew regret when he saw it. It didn't always arrive loud. Sometimes it stood alone in the dark, staring at the land it tried to take, realizing too late that it had lost something much bigger. But he also knew something else. Regret wasn't the end, not for everyone. Sometimes it was just the beginning of reckoning. And reckoning, if handled right, could lead to real change. He turned back toward the house. Behind him, the garden swayed gently, in the night breeze, leaves whispering like prayers. The ground, once contested, now held purpose. The lines, once blurred by deceit, had become paths for growth. And somewhere behind the fences, the man who tried to rewrite the rules now had to live with what he'd revealed. It wasn't just about property anymore. It was about what people chose to grow after the damage had been done. The storm didn't begin with a headline. It began with a file. An anonymous digital envelope, encrypted and untraceable, arrived in the inbox of Marrakeen, a respected investigative reporter for the Atlanta Truth-Ledger. The contents were a carefully indexed folder, timestamps, transcripts, raw audio files, no message, no sender name, just one word on the subject line. Listen. Mara did. And within minutes, she realized she was holding a bomb disguised as a neighborhood dispute. The voices were crisp, undeniable. Grayson Rockwell's voice, clear and self-assured, describing Shaquille O'Neal as a symbol too big for a space, meant to stay clean. Holder Miles, laughing, referencing bleeding culture into solid real estate. Regina Grant whispering tactics to reshuffle demographics quietly. The files played like confessionals, each word sharpening into something uglier than the last. By morning, the Ledger published its expose. Whispers behind the fence. Racism, power, and a gated community's quiet war against one man. The piece struck like lightning. Within hours, the article spread across every major platform. News vans camped outside Chestnut Grove's front gate. Satellite dishes blinking against the manicured skyline. Social media ignited. Hashtags trended. Talk shows dissected the story from every angle. Celebrity, race, property rights, suburban politics. It was no longer a local scandal. It was a national flashpoint. Cameras lined up outside the community, microphones stretching toward anyone willing to speak. Neighbors ducked behind hedges or peered through blinds. The HOA scrambled to issue statements. An emergency meeting was called, but no one wanted to be on record. The once proud symmetry of Chestnut Grove collapsed into paranoia. And through it all, Shaq said nothing. He watched from his porch, expression unreadable. He received dozens of interview requests, national outlets, morning news anchors, podcast producers eager to platform him. He declined them all. No statements, no appearances, no quotes. He let the truth speak without interruption. It was deliberate. A refusal to perform trauma, a rejection of the expectation that the injured must narrate their own pain for public consumption. Shaq didn't need to explain the recordings. The recordings were the explanation, and their power came not from outrage, but from their quiet, casual cruelty. Grayson's fall was swift. By the end of the week, he had been removed from the city planning board. The public backlash made him politically radioactive. The mayor's office issued a bland, non-committal statement about community integrity, and necessary re-evaluation of leadership. Within days, Grayson's position was scrubbed from the city's website. His name, once mentioned in local civic circles with reverence, now prompted rolled eyes and sharp breaths. Holder fared no better. His firm, already wary of national attention, placed him on indefinite leave. Internal investigations were launched. Clients dropped deals. Some demanded refunds. By week's end, his profile vanished from the firm's site, and his assistant stopped answering calls. Regina Grant issued an apology on her personal blog. An 8-paragraph mess of defensiveness, vague regret, and carefully chosen language that said everything without admitting anything. The internet responded swiftly, picking apart every sentence. Sponsors dropped her. Speaking gigs disappeared. The neighborhood itself began to fracture under the weight of its exposure. Longtime residents began holding impromptu meetings in driveways. Some demanded a complete HOA board overhaul. Others suggested hiring diversity consultants. A few pushed back, claiming the recordings were taken out of context, but their voices faded quickly beneath the rising tide of accountability. Inside all of this, Shaq stayed grounded. He watered his garden in the mornings, spoke to volunteers with calm gratitude, listened more than he spoke. He received letters from across the country, some handwritten, some typed, each thanking him, some apologizing for things he hadn't asked for, others recounting similar battles in different cities, different blocks, different codes. He responded to none of them publicly, but he read them all. Delora, now revered quietly by a growing group of neighbors, continued her routines as though nothing had changed. She didn't seek attention. She knew the cost of being seen too clearly. Instead, she offered small nods of solidarity. A thermos passed to Shaq across a low garden bed. A soft tap on his mailbox, with another note inside. This one just saying, "You did what they thought you wouldn't." And yet as the headlines rolled in and the Rockwells fortress collapsed, Shaq understood something deeper. This wasn't victory. It was exposure. And exposure doesn't end things. It only makes them visible. There would be other Graysons, other Halder Miles types, hidden behind newer fences and sharper language. But for now, in this corner of Georgia, something had shifted. The performance of harmony had cracked. The codes had been read aloud, and the silence, which had once been weaponized, now belonged to those who had abused it. Shaq remained still, not because he had nothing to say, but because the truth, when shown unfiltered, didn't need to shout. It echoed. The auditorium wasn't packed with press or cameras. There were no red carpets, no podiums engraved with prestigious logos. It was a school gymnasium, plain and echoey, the kind of place where bleachers creaked under the weight of restless parents and fluorescent lights hummed overhead. The event was meant to be simple, a community literacy night, hosted by the local high school. A few teachers had asked Shaq weeks prior if he might say a few words. They didn't expect much, just a gesture, a minute or two. He said yes, but didn't promise what he'd say. Now, with everything that had unfolded in Chestnut Grove, his name on every tongue, the quiet tension still lingering in the air, the auditorium held a different kind of energy. The students were hushed, some wide-eyed, others checking their phones to see if anyone else was live tweeting. Elders sat at the back with folded hands, remembering their own battles that never made headlines. Parents whispered in cautious tones, unsure of what might come from the man who had turned a gated neighborhood into a national conversation. Shaq stepped up to the mic with no entourage, no notes, just present. He stood there for a moment, silent. Then he leaned in. "I was asked to talk about books," he said, his voice low but full. "But I want to talk about stories." He looked around the room, scanning faces. Teenagers slouched in hoodies. Teachers at the edges. Delora, in the back row, her face unreadable. "We grow up thinking stories are just words on a page," he continued. "Heroes and villains, beginnings and ends. But the truth is, the real stories, the ones that matter, they're the ones people tell about you when you're not in the room." The silence deepened. "And I've learned," he said, "that sometimes the people smiling in your face are the same ones writing you out of your own story." He didn't say the Rockwells' name. He didn't have to. Everyone knew. He talked about walking into spaces built to look fair but not feel it. About how success doesn't insulate you from bias. How wealth can't protect you from whispered doubts, from coded language, from being seen as a symbol instead of a person. "I've played in stadiums," he said. "I've been cheered by thousands, but I've also stood in front of a fence that someone moved behind my back and told me I was imagining it. Laughter flickered through the crowd. Not humor. Recognition. I didn't fight back with anger, he said, because real strength doesn't need to yell. It doesn't need to swing. It just stands. Quiet. Solid. Unmoved. He paused again, letting the words settle. I want you to know, he said, eyes now fixed on the students in the front rows, that there will be rooms that try to make you feel like you don't belong. They'll wrap it in rules, in tradition, in the way things have always been. But you do belong. Because you carry stories too. And when enough of us stop letting other people write them for us, that's when things change. The room was still. And don't get it twisted, he added. This isn't about being famous, or loud, or viral. This is about being whole, about not shrinking, about knowing that you can live with grace and still be unshakable. A few elders nodded. A teacher wiped at her eye. Shaq looked at the microphone for a moment, then stepped back. That's all I came to say. He walked off the stage as the crowd slowly rose, first to clap, then to cheer. Not wildly, not for performance, but because something had cracked open. Something true. By morning, a student's recording of the speech had hit 1 million views. The hashtags returned, but this time they carried more than fury. They carried a message. Teens quoted lines over black and white reels. Elders shared the video with grandchildren. Teachers played it before class. It wasn't the kind of speech people forgot. It was the kind that stayed with them. The kind that reminded them not just of what had happened in Chestnut Grove, but why it mattered. The moving truck arrived on a Wednesday, just after sunrise, its engine groaning beneath the weight of what once was, and would no longer be. The Rockwells didn't announce their departure. There was no farewell barbecue, no round of final invitations, no waves to the neighbors they had once so carefully curated. Just a silent dismantling. Boxes stacked, furniture covered in thick blankets, and voices clipped with urgency. Grayson stood at the end of the driveway, his shoulders slack, watching as the last of the patio furniture was loaded into the truck. The hot tub, long drained and dust-lined, sat cracked and silent, like the monument to a lost war. No one offered to help him. No one came by to see them off. In a place where appearances were everything, their disappearance was quiet, efficient, and absolute. Shaq watched from a distance, not out of satisfaction, but curiosity. He had known many endings, some bitter, some necessary. But this one felt different. Grayson wasn't leaving because he had to. He was leaving because he couldn't stay. And there was a difference. By noon, the house was empty. The for sale sign that had stood in the Rockwells' yard for weeks now bore a red banner, sold. And within days, a new family arrived. They came in a modest hybrid SUV. No fanfare. The parents, a black woman with a dimpled smile and a white husband with an easy laugh, stepped out with 2 kids, one clutching a potted plant, the other carrying a skateboard. They waved first. They introduced themselves without hesitation. Their names were different. Their presence felt different. Not performative, just present. Shaq met them on the sidewalk with a tray of cookies baked by Delora, her quiet tradition passed forward. I heard you had the best tomatoes in town, the mother said, glancing toward the community garden. I try to keep 'em honest, Shaq replied, smiling. Their handshake was firm. Their warmth, unforced. There was no pause in their speech, no subtle checking of social cues, no discomfort with proximity. For the first time in a long time, Chestnut Grove felt like it was breathing again. The changes weren't instant. They weren't even obvious at first. But they began. A few more neighbors joined the garden roster. A group of local high schoolers started repainting the old park bench near the pond. A welcome committee, one that had once served more as a screening process, was quietly restructured. Conversations about inclusion became less performative and more practical. The HOA, now missing several of its most rigid voices, began reevaluating its charter with the help of new members. Delora was invited to sit in on sessions. As an informal advisor, she declined the title but offered suggestions, slipping notes beneath doors as she always had. One evening, as summer curled into fall, a neighborhood potluck unfolded across 3 front lawns, tables lined with dishes, kids chasing each other barefoot, laughter not from a single clique, but from everyone. No hot tub required. No scheming behind fences, just people. Complicated, imperfect, but trying. Shaq stood by the garden, a watering can in hand, gently feeding the basil leaves that had just begun to reach upward again. The soil was damp beneath his shoes, The air smelled of fresh cilantro, grilled corn, and possibility. He looked out over the neighborhood, not as a man who had won, but as one who had endured. Victory was never the goal. Survival wasn't either. It was dignity, presence, refusal to be erased. Behind him, the house once occupied by the Rockwells now shone differently in the light. Not because the paint had changed, but because the energy had. There were drawings taped to the front window, a rainbow chalk mural on the driveway, and laughter, real, uncalculated laughter, drifted through the hedges. Shaq smiled, not out of triumph, but from understanding. Hate hadn't disappeared. It never does, but it had been revealed, and in its place, new roots had taken hold. The garden rustled behind him, catching the breeze, and somewhere deep in the quiet soil, something better was growing. If this story made you pause, made you feel, made you see, then you already know it's more than fiction. It's reflection. It's the truth behind too many fences, too many smiles. Stay with us because the next story could be your street, your silence, your stand. We're not just telling stories, we're turning whispers into wake-ups. And we're just getting started.